the motives are still the same, right? It's to a mind control population, basically, to direct them into a certain political narrative that is more in line with the rulers, so that the rulers can still stay in power, so that the money could still flow up to them. So it's apparent everywhere you look these days.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and a few weeks ago, I got an email that started as follows. Hello, I'm an American Emmy Award-winning writer, producer, director with a true story that I'd like to share with you and your audience. It is based on my personal experience of being a paid propagandist for a Balkan War criminal. After a little bit of research and a conversation with my Kosovo specialist, it became clear to me that this was a true story, so I invited its author. I'm talking today to Joe Tripician, the man who was tasked with creating a biography of Franjo Tudjman, the leader of Croatia, when it broke apart from Yugoslavia. Joe, welcome.
Thank you, Pascal. Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming online, and I hope I didn't butcher your name. I forgot to ask you if your last name is pronounced Tripician. Is that correct?
It's Tripician.
Okay, almost.
But it's whatever.
Then let's start with your story. And since you're a storyteller, why don't you start yourself where you think it should begin and tell us what happened?
Oh, well, for me, it began in 1997. I was recently divorced. I was deep in debt. And this job had landed in my lap. I was introduced to a man named Yakov Sedlar. And he still is a Croatian film and theater director. Back then, he was also the official cultural attaché of Croatia to the United Nations. And I still had my video production company where I did a lot of post-production work and animation. And the introduction to him was he asked me to do a job, to do a little animated map of Croatia for a travelogue he was producing. So like any other ignorant American, I couldn't locate Croatia on the map. So I had to go to a store to buy a map. And it had a very strange disclaimer on it. It said, size is subject to change from acts of war. Now, that's a little bit of a joke, but this was 2 years after the bloody Balkan Wars of the 90s. And so some of your viewers may know about the history, but for me, I didn't know a thing about it. So I did the job. He thanked me. He paid me. And some months later, he came back and he had a script he wanted me to review. And it was a script for a biography of Franjo Tudjman. Franjo Tudjman, Croatia's first president. That was, as you mentioned in the introduction, immediately after Croatia broke apart from Yugoslavia. And so I read it through, and it had a section in there about Tudjman's book, which was published some years earlier, called The Horrors of War. And in that book, it caused some controversy, where Tudjman claimed that the Jews in Jasenovac, which was Croatia's notorious concentration camp during the Second World War, that the concentration camp was run in part by the Jews who were interred there. And I said this to Yakov as delicately as I could. I said, this film you plan to show in New York, right? He said, yes. I said, well, there's a Jewish community here. You may want to rephrase this section. And he looked at me like he didn't understand it. Anyway, so I gave him my notes, and then a few months later, he returned and asked me to write the official biography of Franjo Tudjman. Well, this caught me by surprise. I had then quickly asked the person who introduced us, which was my doctor, which was also Yakov's doctor, how this came about. He says, well, Joe, I know you're a filmmaker and you're also an author. It's going to do highly because I knew, you're broke and you need the work. And it's true. At that time, I had published my first book. It's a humor book. It's called The Official Alien Abductees Handbook, sort of a self-help book for Alien Abductees. Again, I emphasize it's a humor book. Anyway, so I was puzzled. I said, Yakov, I only had this one book published, and it's an alien book. Why are you asking me? And he says, Joe, no, Joe, you're a very important artist. You would tell your story. I said, why would you want an American? He said, we want the American point of view to tell Tuđman what a great man he is. I said, well, if you want that, you should just hire a PR firm. There's lots of them here in New York. He says, no, Joe, you really must do it. I said, look, first of all, I don't know anything about Tuđman, and I could be very critical about it. Give me the weekend and I'll get back to you. So I did some quick research. I found that Tuđman was lauded as the savior of a Croatian people because he fought against Serb aggression and he brought his country more or less safely into independence. And also Tuđman was vilified as a neo-Nazi, Idi Amin of the Balkans, a butcher of the Balkans, and other terms less flattering. So I met with Yakov on the Monday after that weekend. I said, look, Yakov, I can't possibly write this book, because if you really, want a official glowing book about Tuđman, A, I can't do that. I'd have no, credibility. And B, even if I could, I wouldn't, I don't want to become known as a paid propagandist. And he says, no, Joe, you absolutely must. He was very insistent, And I said, look, I'm going to be critical. If I find something that I don't agree with, I'm going to be critical. He says, yeah, Joe, look, I'll help you, give you information. And he handed me this glossy brochure. It had a photograph of Franjo Tudjman shaking hands with Bill Clinton. He was, of course, the president during the Balkan Wars. And he says, look at this. Here's your president and our president. Clinton loves Croatia. You must do book. I said, look, the only way I do this, if you give me total editorial control. He says, yes, of course, we give you that. Be careful what you ask for. This is a lesson for everyone out there. And it was a big one for me. Because when he said that, I said, look, you sure you know what you're agreeing to? He says, yeah. You have editorial control and we pay you $40,000 up front. Great, when do I go? That's how my journey into the Balkans started. So I had a contract written up. He signed it. He said, this is all perfectly normal. I said, yeah, it's perfectly normal. And so within 2 months, I landed in Zagreb. Now, during that 2-month period, I had hired a researcher who was a son of Croatian immigrants to the United States. And during the war, he was a very vociferous supporter of Tuđman. He was also a translator for Tuđman on many occasions in peace negotiations. So he knew practically everybody there. I later heard some gossip and rumors that his name is George Rudman, that George did some freelancing for the CIA. I can't verify that, so that's an allegation. Anyway, so I had him on one side of the equation. And then I met a young man named Ivo Skoric, who had political refugee in the United States, because he was an independent journalist and wrote some highly unflattering things about Tuđman. And so he was granted asylum, and he had given me a different point of view than George did. He talked about how Tuđman if you interview Tuđman, he'll just give you a plate of fish and talk about great Croatian history and blah, blah, blah. And he'll never really, answer the questions about war crimes, and about concentration camps in Bosnia. So I had George on the right and Ivo on the left. And with that information, I landed in Zagreb and immediately went to the American embassy, tell them who I was, why I was here. And the man, Doug Davidson, who was the information officer at that time, seemed completely puzzled by why the Croatian government would hire me someone who's not a historian, whose only, published book was a book about aliens, why they wanted me to do it. I said, it's something I've always wanted to do. Foreign affairs is my first love. Now, at this point, a lot of people would ask me, okay, what was your real incentive? I know money must have been the incentive. I said, yes. But remember, I was also recently divorced and was hoping as a newly single man to meet some Balkan women who might be impressed by an American passport. So that's one of my first confessions. So I then had Yakov take me to office to meet politician after politician, interview after interview. Never have I been lied to by so many people in such a short period of time. And they all wanted to explain to me how the war started very simply, very recently, back in the 11th century. So there is a strain of truth when people talk about ancient ethnic rivalries. But to rewind back to the beginning of the troubles in the Balkans, you have to understand that these are the people who lived together, intermarried, raised families together, for decades and decades. And during the time of Tito, who had a delicate balancing act between East and West, the non-alignment, political positioning, he was able to keep the different ethnic groups united by the worst possible method, by suppression. So any expression of nationalist identity or cultural identity or what have you, you go sent to Goliath, which was known as Naked Island, which was this island like Alcatraz, which is a notorious prison. So, of course, that's going to give some blowback. And what happened in the 70s was Croatian Spring. And Franjo Tudjman was part of that rebellion. He was jailed twice, actually, for his writings about expressing Croatian nationalism. And so when Tito died, everything fell apart because he was the only one keeping everything together. Everything was central. It was a country, someone said, where the profits are nationalized and the losses are socialized because the power resided in Belgrade, which was landlocked. But Croatia, formed like a croissant, they had a very thin but long strip of land bordering on the Adriatic. And they got a lot of the bulk of the revenue of the country through tourism. And so there was a lot of resentment in that, as you can imagine. So after Tito kicked the bucket, Slobodan Milosevic took advantage of the death and made a speech in Kosovo where at first he didn't realize what he was doing, but he got such a response when he says, no more will they suppress you, because the Serbs were a minority in Kosovo and the Muslims were in the majority. And so because of this suppression of nationalism, nationalistic identity and cultural identity, he was able to foment a revolt with the Serb minorities in Kosovo and primarily in Croatia. Croatia was prime territory for the taking. And so that's when we started to see the various country areas, states within Yugoslavia break off into independent countries. First one, second one, the third one, second one being Croatia, third one being Bosnia-Herzegovina. And what happened was that this started skirmishes, fights, which then became you kill my neighbor, I'll burn your house, you burn my house, I'll slaughter your village. These became a war of reprisals, and which lasted several years. And so that's how it began. That's how I got placed in the middle of it 2 years after peace was brokered in Dayton, Ohio, in the United States.
Yeah, because the way that Yugoslavia broke apart very violently stands in stark contrast to how the Soviet Union broke apart largely peacefully, right? With some exceptions, but the breakup of Yugoslavia, which took place between 91 and 99, 2000, I think the current day Serbia is actually goes back to 2002, right? We had remnants of Yugoslavia, the Federal Republic that existed until 2002, I believe.
Yeah, they had to kick, Milosevic out, and
Yeah.
he wound up in The Hague, and he died there. Which Tuđman definitely would have wound up in The Hague had he not died in '99.
And the important thing is that, of course, Serbia was the strongest part of Yugoslavia, and the largest part of the Yugoslav army was Serbs. And this is what you're telling me is of course strange, because Kosovo was an integral part of Yugoslavia, right? But these one of the biggest mistakes that Tito made was that he created the divisions within his country alongside these old ethnic borderlands, instead of actually creating something more integrated. But what then started happening from 1991 onward was this step-by-step breaking away of these different republics, and Croatia being, of course, the most crucial one, again because it's the entire coastline. I mean, without Croatia, Serbia is basically landlocked. And also, the Serbs and the Croats don't live properly in Serbia and Croatia, right? They are everywhere and intermarried. It's not just village, Serb village and Croat village. It's Serbs and Croats within the same village. That's why this breakup was so absolutely horrible. And the worst, some of the most famous war crimes, Srebrenica. Help me. It was in 1995, right?
Well, I mean, dates. I didn't know there would be a checkup on dates on this interview, but I can easily find it out.
I'm sorry, because like the timeline actually matters quite a lot. I'm also embarrassed that I don't have it properly in front of me. It's just because so many things happened with different actors then also sabotaging each other. But maybe let's go now into 1997, when you are there in Croatia, now independent and its own country for itself. And how did that continue? I mean, did you realize that you were lied to so much by these people, or lied to? I mean, they were probably feeding you a narrative, right? A way that they wanted their own national history to be believed.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just mention, I didn't mention the first country that broke apart, which was Slovenia. And there, Milosevic says, "Oh, look, you just have it. It's very homogeneous." And they didn't have anything that Milosevic wanted. Like you said, he was really focused on Croatia. But yeah, I mean, I was so frustrated after these interviews, which none of them gave me any information that was real. So I turned immediately to some of the contacts that Ivo had given me, which were independent journalists and dissidents. And it was quite interesting because when I made my first phone call to a journalist, he says, "Oh, yes, Mr. Joe Tripician, we heard you were here. We were wondering when you'd call." And he said, "Please do not tell me any information because our phone is being bugged by the police." So immediately my paranoia level started rising. But I was committed to the job, and I was day after day it became more apparent to me, what a untenable position I put myself in. Because if I wrote what they wanted me to write, what the government wanted me to write, I'd be known as a paid propagandist. And that's something I really wasn't comfortable living with. But if I wrote, what became more and more apparent to me, which was the truth, then I would be an enemy of the state. And when I learned and met these different journalists, some of whom have had their cars bombed because they wrote what the government didn't like, I became more concerned about that option. So it eventually became clearer to me the reason behind them hiring me was because, not just because Yakov's doctor introduced us, but because they're undergoing a large public relations campaign to refurnish, Tuđman's image in the eyes of the West. Now, big reason for that was that Croatia wanted to enter the EU, which they did eventually, and that number two, or maybe number one, that Tuđman was deathly afraid of being called to the International War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague. And so when I actually handed in my manuscript some months later, Yakov had called me, immediately the next day, said, "Joe, please come in. We like your book, but please come in. Let's have a talk." I said, "Okay." So he sat me down and he said, "Joe, you write a very good book, very good book. Very small notes. His first, please do not mention anything of the communist time." I said, "Well, that was a big part of Tuđman's, political career. He was a army general, a desk general in Tito's, campaign. He was the youngest one at 23. He really quickly rose into the ranks. People are still debating how he did that. Was he a snitch, or whatever?" And then Yakov said, "The another thing is the title, I said, "What's wrong with In Tito's Shadow? I think it's very, it's descriptive of the man and the country." He said, "No, please, nothing about former communist time." I said, "Okay, anything else?" He said, "Yes. Oh, please do not mention anything about war crimes." I said, "It's not going to be believable. I can't do that. If you really want the West, particularly America, to learn about Croatia, how great it is, how they came through as a winner in the Balkan Wars, how America backed them, with military, advising support, and turning the other way as the weapons came in. If you really want Croatia to be known as a big friend of America, you've got to learn to be honest, because anything else is going to come off as bogus, So we went back and forth in that. I had bargained to give me $10,000 and I'll do a little rewrite on it. And I tried sincerely to try to make it more balanced, but they didn't like that. So the book was never published. And,
so the book In Tito's Shadow doesn't exist today.
Well, it does exist. It's just not published. I may publish it eventually, but the book I did publish is it's the memoir behind me about Balkanized at Sunrise, which gives all the details, not just about the political machinations or the spy work I did with the independent journalists, and also my encounters with Bosnian and Croatian women, none of which was successful. So that was a bust.
Let's talk a little bit about what you actually learned when you were there. So it became absolutely clear that you were part of Croatia's approach through middlemen, right, to rewrite history in a convenient way for Croatia, and especially for Tuđman, who was, in 1993, the so-called the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was created, and between 1993 and until it was dissolved, I think in 2017, it did a tremendous lot of research into war crimes, and it was tasked with researching war crimes on all sides, and famously, it actually indicted Milosevic, right? And Milosevic mysteriously died, apparently hung himself, although there's controversy about that one, while in custody in I think he was in The Hague at the time, and the chance that even highest political leaders would be indicted and would have to be extradited to The Hague was real, right?
Yes.
So there was a real incentive for Croatia to say like, no, 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 we need a clean slate, a clean history. So let's go out.
Let me give you no, let me give you the story here. So Yakov had arranged for me to interview Tuđman on camera. He had a whole camera crew there, and then I spent the better part of 2 days interviewing Tuđman. The first one, I'm shaking my head because I had a recurring migraine. But I think back of it, I asked, this goes like this. So tell me about how you got involved in Croatian politics. Literally 40 minutes later, he was still giving me an answer for that. And the camera crew, the camera guys were falling asleep, at this. And so I said, okay, look, this is the next day. I decided to just go for the big questions. Okay, so I said the day before the second interview, which was October 6th, 1997, a deal was announced that 10 of the Bosnian Croat war crime suspects would voluntarily surrender to The Hague. Okay, and that announcement was immediately followed by the release of $40 million in credit in Croatia by the International Monetary Fund. Okay, so I asked them, I said, okay, yesterday, Mr. President, Croatia agreed that its war criminals will surrender themselves to The Hague. I said, do you see war crimes as an unavoidable part of war? And he answered, he says, I'm going to quote him now, I am not in favor of regarding in the same terms those who caused the aggression, who caused all these tragedies, who jeopardized both the existence of Croatia and the life of its citizens, and those people who, during various operations, could not control their feelings of revenge, their wishes to retaliate. So he just admitted that he supported these guys, and it goes further than that. So
that's a yes. That's a yes. It's like yes. If we do it, if we did it, it was okay. If the others did it, it was obvious war crimes and have to be persecuted. But if we did it, it was okay. Which international law does not. It doesn't work like that.
Yes. But here's the thing: in the Balkans, during and after the war, it's like our war heroes are your war criminals. Your war criminals are our war heroes. Okay. In fact, in 2017, there was this other Croatian film director, Slobodan Praljak, who famously committed suicide in court after being sentenced, for war crimes. 12 days later, he was given a huge honor in the city of Zagreb, attended by ministers and politicians at the top level. A hero. So you can look at it from their point of view, or the people who live there, saying these men who you were calling war criminals, they defended our homes. They saved our lives. Okay, so when it comes down to it, my question still remains, are war crimes an inevitable part of war? Probably yes. Can you mention any wars that have not contained war crimes?
Yeah. And still, they're illegal. It's like saying, are crimes an inevitable part of a nation state? Yes, they are. Should they go unpunished because they are? No, no, they're not.
Yes,
it's like, no, that was the whole point also about the tribunal, to say like, no, we look into everybody's war crimes, and then everybody will have to live up to what they did, right? And that's of course something that both sides did not accept when it hit them. It's what you want the other one to hit.
Yeah, and when I interviewed these 10 war crime suspects who voluntarily surrendered themselves to The Hague, the lawyer who represented them said to me, well, this is just happening because America feels guilty that they didn't stop the war in the first place.
Which might not be untrue, but
it's still no excuse.
No, still no excuse.
Yeah, so it gets more intriguing than that, because one of the major people I interviewed was a character I called the priest, but his real name is Vladislav Pogarčić, who was representing, sort of like the minister of propaganda for the little mini statelet of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Okay, so in the height of the war in 22, 23, you had all three sides fighting each other.
92, 93. Yeah.
Yes, in central Bosnia. Okay, so it was just continual day after day bloodbath. And according to Peter Galbraith, who was the first ambassador to Croatia, and Richard Holbrooke, both of them who I interviewed in person, they were pushing Tudjman to, have an alliance with the Bosnian military so that they could join and push back against the Serb aggression. And it wasn't until the Washington Agreement came about where they did that. Now, I asked this question to Galbraith just recently, a couple of years back, and I said, don't you think that, this delay that Tuđman had in not wanting to join forces with the Bosnian military was that he wanted his forces to claim more territory than Bosnia-Herzegovina before he agreed to that alliance. And Galbraith says, that's an interesting question, but I don't believe that. I believe that he doesn't, he just didn't feel ready. He had a big hatred of the Muslims, and we had to push him. So when you speak to people like Galbraith and Holbrooke, it's from a real American point of view. Now, again, this is a war that the United States desperately did not want to enter. And it wasn't until, the war hawks, like Madeleine Albright and Richard Holbrooke said it was imperative that we stop genocide in our time. So it was not for any territorial, had no real vital interest in there, as the former Secretary of State Baker said, we have no dog in this fight. But when it became apparent that, through the grace of CNN, where they displayed the market bombing in Sarajevo, and these people that were killed by the Serbs' bombs were white, middle-class shoppers, looked just like us. So there was, pushback, and it became how do you say that? Became an issue in the presidential race. So Clinton eventually, won that race, and he felt he had to follow up on it. But it was people like Holbrooke who had pushed Christopher Warren, the Secretary of State, for their involvement in backing that. So they first got involved at a distance, and then later got the UN agreement to have NATO do some bombing.
Yeah, of course, that's what it then all came down to in 1999, right? It's
95. 95.
Sorry,
You're talking
not
about
speaking about the
Kosovo.
bombing. Sorry, I'm talking.
Okay.
You're talking about Kosovo, not about Serbia later.
I saw your video on NATO, and I'm talking about when NATO had UN resolution, and that was in run up to the Dayton Peace Accord. And so it's basically bombing Milosevic into a negotiating table. They had plenty of broken peace agreements prior to that, and it did come down to the wire about territory. And what Holbrooke said to me, he says that Tuđman was key to Dayton, because without his agreement on anything, nothing would have happened. And the agreement, the peace wouldn't happen. As again, I mentioned it, Dayton Peace Accord, still the longest ceasefire in history. It's a failed state because of the way that everything was structured. It was structured to stick in amber this uneasy alliance, where you have, a weak central authority, which is a combination of the Croatian and the Bosnian entities, giving 51% of that state to them and 49% to Republika Srpska, who kept the name Republika Srpska, which was an insult to the Bosnian Muslims.
And now we're talking about Bosnia, the state of the country of Bosnia-Herzegovina, right?
Yes,
the way that it
exactly.
exists today. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But what was your main learning outcome of this one? Like understanding that what they wanted you to do is to write a hagiography about the holy Franjo Tudjman, who could do no wrong and had no past with no communist past. I mean, again, the guy was a communist under Tito.
Tito.
He was an apartheid, right? Just like Yeltsin was an apartheid of the Soviet Union's Communist Party. He too was one of them, just like Milosevic and the others, right? They were all inside his party, and then the thing is, the party also broke apart, right? They wanted to forget about that history. What they wanted to focus on was on the heroic fight for freedom and liberty, right? In Croatia,
independence.
And no war crimes.
No. But what it came down to is a pickup. I know I didn't finish the story about the priest, Vlado Pogačić, is that he had worked for Mati Boban. And Mati Boban was the president of the short-lived little Bosnian Croat statelet called Bosna Herzegovina. And what Boban was known for was being incredibly loyal, blood, body, and soul to Franjo Tudjman, who he viewed as a saint, as a savior of Croatian people. And so what he did is follow word for word Tudjman's orders. And so when Tudjman put the word out that we need to put these people in some concentration camps and take care of them, Boban jumped on that. Okay, and this was obviously a sticking point for the U.S. to get involved in supporting Croatia because they didn't want to get involved with someone who was, committing war crimes. And so through Peter Galbraith had made it his mission to make sure that Boban was no longer in power. Okay, so Galbraith came on TV, on Croatian TV, and talked about the war crimes that Boban was committing, and that he should stop. He cannot use food as a weapon because Boban was stopping the convoys of foods coming in. They supposedly were supposed to allow aid to come in during the war, and so soon after that, Boban fell on his sword. He just said, "Okay, I'm going to resign. I'm wrong. I did everything I did. You're right. It's true." And that allowed Tudjman to not have that stain of Boban on him. However, of course, it all came out eventually in the War Crimes Tribunal. And it was just interesting to hear Vlado Pogačić speak about this. Again, he was the spokesperson. He was the head of humanitarian issues, for Mati Boban. And he said Mati Boban was a very complex person. Yes, his fatal flaw was being too loyal to Tuđman. And he had done everything that Tuđman wanted, and Tuđman threw him away. So I could see that the man had such a conflicted feeling about Tuđman and Boban. He felt really some loyalty and love for Boban, but a lot of hatred for Tuđman. It's just emblematic of one of many of the political stories about the people who are used up for bigger purposes. Okay.
Yeah.
But when he said that, he was telling me about how Tuđman would not allow to join forces with the Bosnian Muslim army until he was given assurances, according to Galbraith, de Galbraith giving assurances that the United States will back Croatia's entry into the EU, help him with the IMF, International Monetary Fund, but also would take all that away if they didn't join forces. So that was the turning point in the war because Serbs lost more and more territory. The Bosnian Muslim, Bosnian Croat and Bosnian Muslim joint forces gained more and more territory, but still there was a lot of tension between the two. But at the end, the story, just to answer your question, the biggest lesson was not to get involved in international politics.
The two more things I would surely like to discuss. First, what kind of war crimes of Tuđman himself did you learn about? Because there's these different levels of war crimes, right? If a soldier on the battlefield shoots another soldier who's already waving the white flag, then that's a war crime, but that's on that individual soldier. If a political leader orders concentration camps or something like that to be built, and then people to be put there, and in the worst case, and then even be like executed, or their human rights be violated, then that's a state war crime, right? Which ones did you learn about, and also want to say like, no, I cannot not write about them in the book?
Yes, well, it was clear about Tudjman's connection with the concentration camps in Bosnia. And after Tudjman's death, there were indictments handed down by The Hague against the generals, and they mentioned Tudjman's role in what they called the Joint Criminal Enterprise, which was aimed at permanently removing Serbs from Croatia. There was Operation Storm in '95.
That's an ethnic cleansing, right? An ethnic cleansing operation. Yeah, that's a war.
Yeah. So there was numerous instances of ethnic cleansing and war crimes, and those are the highlights.
Yeah, political war crimes, and then maybe you're learning a outcome of how it is that they wanted you to do this. Somebody who's in. Did you already have your Emmy back at the time, or not yet? Were you?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did, because that was in '91, '92.
So do you think
I was hired in '97?
Do you think they wanted somebody they could say like, look, this is an Emmy award-winning director, and who then would, in Hollywood, sell this to the American public? That was the goal, right?
Yeah, and let me tell you something I didn't mention. It was that after I had reviewed the script for Yakov's biographical film about Franjo Tudjman, Croatian George Washington, and before he hired me to do the book, he had made the biography. He handed me a copy. I played it, and it said in the opening credits, directed by Yakov Sedlar and Joe Tripician. Now, normally I don't mind sharing credits, but I actually prefer to have actually worked on the film. And I realized this was part of his, okay, Joe, see what I'm doing for you. Now you have a name of this great. By the way, Yakov's films just so ham-fisted. They're just as political propaganda. They were so obvious. As art and technicality, they were sub-B level. He's known as the Croatian Leni Riefenstahl, but I added, but without the talent. And he's got to such a reputation that recently, the most recent film he made was starring this actor who was desperate for work, Kevin Spacey. And this was 2 years ago. Yakov made this documentary biographical film where Kevin Spacey played, get ready for it, Franjo Tudjman.
No way.
Really? No way, dude. And it was called Once Upon a Time in Croatia. Now, I've only was able to get a couple of clips from Croatian TV because it's not been released. And I don't know, the real reason is Yakov says he didn't get the money to release it. But I recall speaking to a number of people, including producers and camera people who worked for Yakov in the late 90s, who still haven't been paid by him. And there is the film that I supposedly co-directed with Yakov. You can't get a copy of unless you look on eBay, because the master and all the other copies are kept in the lab, still haven't been paid by Yakov. So Yakov, he paid me this money, but when he paid me this money, he paid it to me in different installments. The first check was written on the Croatian National Theater. Another check was written by, I swear to God, an Italian restaurant in Queens, New York. So he was able to collect money and contributions from the diaspora in $5,000, $10,000 donations. And he's able to use that along with state money when he was still working for Tuđman to make his work. But, after Tuđman died, he was able to still collect money, and he had quite a talent for that.
So your story is actually, it's not just how the Croatian state or Tuđman tried to rewrite his own history, but how the people who thought this was important. I mean, this character Yakov obviously believes himself that it is important to correctly portray Croatian history, right? So it's not just the state. It's people who, it's propagandists, people, ideologues who then want to spin a narrative and do that by different means, and then also engage people like you in order to tell the story. And they will reach out, and that's how you create a narrative, like if you do that big enough.
Yeah, and and so you look back on it from today's perspective, and you see, look, those propaganda efforts were nothing. I mean, you look at whatever these other authoritarian states are, and the type of propaganda that they're pushing out, and it's supercharged, of course, through social media, highly sophisticated, highly targeted, and it's like, but the motives are still the same, right? It's to mind control population, basically, to direct them into a certain political narrative that is more in line with the rulers, so that the rulers can still stay in power, so that the money could still flow up to them. So it's apparent everywhere you look these days. But what is interesting currently is the types of protests that are happening in places like Serbia. Okay, the spontaneous protests that were spurred by this fatal crash of this train station, and it was just sparked by students, and then the students eventually joined by the farmers, eventually joined by middle-class people. So we have tens of thousands of people, right? And you've got countries, like Serbia, and then you have the Republic of Srpska, who owns a lot of allegiance to Serbia. Serbia owns a lot of allegiance to Russia. Now, Dodik, who's the president, Republic of Srpska, is now wanted. There's like a arrest warrant out on his name because he had gone against the High Representative, which is a independent party who oversees the political functions of Bosnia-Herzegovina to make sure that everyone is aligned with the Dayton Peace Accords. So Dodik says, no, we're going to secede. We're going to have our own rules, our own regulations. And a lot of this comes from the same type of thinking where, our war heroes are your war criminals. Your war criminals are our war heroes. Genocide denial is against the law in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But the Republic of Srpska said, no, no longer. We don't agree to that law. And once you start getting into historical revisionism and genocide denial, you can whip up a lot of trouble in a very short period of time. So it's very dicey,
Yeah,
right now.
yeah, and it's Kosovo is still in a very difficult place because now, Bosnia, I want to say, is still in a very difficult political place, but and Kosovo too, of course. The issue, though, of this way in which propaganda works is one of the things that most concerns me, because it's still we're right now so embedded in it, right? Especially when it comes to Ukraine, and this need of people to create like saints, right? It reminds me very much of how Mr. Zelensky is portrayed as a saint who can do no wrong, and has been portrayed for the longest time. That then the people that especially Western sides support are often depicted like that, right? They are the ones who would never commit war crimes, or you cannot talk about war crimes in this sense, which has a long history and pedigree, right? If you even go just back to the Second World War, and the fact that
Dresden.
well, Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the firebombs of Tokyo, and all of those were, of course, not punished, because if the war crimes are committed by the good side, by the good guys, by us,
Yeah.
then they're not war crimes. And this continues and continues and continues.
You have to take sides, as someone said, okay?
Yeah.
If you're going to be involved with politics, eventually you're going to be carrying water for some side or another, all right? So yeah, that's a big problem. There's a writer that influenced me a lot. His name is Robert Anton Wilson. And he says that he calls humans domesticated primates. He says that each of us live in our own reality tunnels. So if you're born in Dublin, Ireland, you see an Irish Catholic reality tunnel. If you're born in Moscow, you see a Marxist reality tunnel for your whole life. If you're born in Iran, you see Islamic fundamentalist reality tunnel. If you're born in Arkansas, you see a Christian fundamentalist reality tunnel. So because these of our basic mammalian territorial imperatives, all mammals want territory, right? And so, the mammals, market with excretions, okay? And we, domesticated primates, market with ink excretions on paper, land treaties, and we divide things into borders, but we have an instinctual desire and need for identity and into a group, okay, which is fine up to a point. But, our reality tunnels are not the universe. The map is not the territory. The menu is not a meal. You can't eat a menu, okay? At a certain point, we have to get back to understanding, cognitive science. And this is what the propagandists have excelled at. And the people who are trying to fight against propaganda have not yet mastered.
Yeah, but it also shows our inability, even if we try as much as we can, to understand stuff objectively. We will always understand things narratively as a story. We will connect dots, and we will create timelines, right? And then the most straightforward thing to do is to create a timeline and a story that suits your own, as you would put it, the tunnel, right?
The reality tunnel.
The reality tunnel. And people go very far for that and pay other people in order to recreate the reality tunnel for other populations, so that they can share that tunnel, at least in this aspect. And then part of the tunnel is, of course, that you don't see what's beyond the walls, right? And you're
well, hopefully that you can create a society where you have a balance of power, where you've got, people from the judiciary checking what's going on with the Congress, checking what's going on with the executive branch. This is why authoritarians like to get all of the branches under their power, so that there are no more checks and balances. So there are no more limits on their power. So there are no more limits to the amount of power and money and damage they can do if they're a wild ass authoritarian who are narcissistic and self-destructive.
Yeah. And we need, of course, the acceptance that there are different reality tunnels, even contradictory ones at the same time. And we need to live with that fact. And
Yeah,
we need to live with the fact that one man's war criminals are another man's heroes, right? Or one man's terrorists are another man's freedom fighters. I mean, we need to live with that. And then we need to approach it somehow.
Yeah. And the fact is that, yeah, Tuđman was the only person to actually be able to lead his country out of war, and successfully against the Serbs. He was able to put together like a fighting force overnight when Serbia, Milosevic, had control, as you said earlier, of the JNA, the Yugoslav National Army, and all the weapons. Now, where do you find an effective fighting force overnight? You've got a limited amount of soldiers, but you need much more. So where else do you look? You look for the thugs, the assassins, the killers for hire. How come there weren't more war crimes? Maybe that should be really the question.
Yeah, yeah. And it needs to be accepted Tuđman was a hero and a war criminal, period. Both at the same time.
Both at the same time. You're so rare. I'm so glad we spoke about this. You're one of the first people who can really understand this, in a long time that I've spoken to.
Well, I'm glad we could work this out because it's, these are facts, these are realities that if we don't accept them and don't deal with them, they will ruin us. And the worst thing we can do is to create this, as you said, a hagiography of some political leader who we then falsely identify with the solution to all problems. That's not, they are not.
Yeah, without, in the 15-year anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accords, Richard Holbrooke gave a speech at the new university in New York City. And so I was there, and he said there were certain things that, he would have done differently. One, was not to have a reconciliation commission like South Africa had. Okay. Without reconciliation, without saying, okay, yes, you committed this crime. Yes, I admit it. I committed this crime. Yes, you affected these people. Yes, I can agree. I affected these people. Okay. And without that, you're not going to ask for forgiveness. You're just going to ask for reconciliation. But reconciliation doesn't mean that they don't get put in jail for crimes that they committed. Reconciliation means you come to reconcile your own past and maybe your own complicity. Maybe you were caught up. Maybe you stopped speaking with your neighbor. Maybe you actually there's an old creation expression which summarizes this. It's an old creation curse. May God strike dead my neighbor's cow.
Not my neighbor, my neighbor's cow.
My neighbor's cow. That's where it begins. It begins with the animals first, and then it progresses up to the human level.
That's what we need to stop.
Yeah.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that because I have a video with a German judge who she was working with the tribunal in South Africa, and she has a very passionate story to tell about that as well. I will now think about if I first publish this talk or first hers, but they definitely go together because reconciliation is what we need to strive for. Joe Tripician, I would like to thank you very much for sharing your story and for giving us additional insights.
It's been a pleasure, Pascal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.